Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who thought their feelings should dictate everyone else's behavior and discovered that actions have consequences. One involves a parking lot confrontation solved by an Oscar-worthy lie, another a boss who demanded strict hours and got exactly that, and the last a neighbor who keyed a muscle car over engine noise and now has a for sale sign in her yard. I lied about my son to win a parking argument. It worked. I'm not proud, but I'm not sorry. I was pulling into a busy shopping center on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of place where everyone drives like they're auditioning for a demolition derby, but also somehow terrified of parking too close to anyone else. I just swung around the main aisle and lined up to back into a perfectly good spot when another car darted in nose first and took it. No big deal. I adjusted, rolled forward a few feet, and backed into the space between that car and a small SUV. There was plenty of room. I'm not one of those people who wedges in so tight you need butter and a prayer to get out. I centered the car, turned it off, and started to open my door. That's when the SUV's window shot down like we were in some kind of low-budget Western showdown. "Are you serious right now?" a woman shrieked from inside. I froze halfway out of the car. For a split second, I thought maybe I knew her, maybe this was a weird joke, maybe I had parked crooked and hadn't realized it. I glanced down the line of paint, checked my mirrors, and saw nothing unusual. "There are so many other open spots," she continued, waving one manicured hand around the parking lot like she was presenting it to a jury. "Why did you have to park right next to me?" It wasn't just annoyance. She was genuinely upset, like I had violated some sacred unspoken parking covenant. I looked around. Sure, there were other spots. There are almost always other spots. But this was a normal, perfectly acceptable parking maneuver in a public lot. I hadn't scratched her car, I hadn't boxed her in, I hadn't even parked particularly close. I was already in a bit of a mood that day and didn't have the emotional bandwidth for whatever this was. At the same time, I found myself weirdly fascinated. What kind of person loses it over a legally parked car? I shut my door, turned toward her window, and said calmly, "Is there a problem?" "Yes," she snapped. "You parked right next to me. You couldn't just give me space?" There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not confusion, just pure entitlement. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, something in my brain decided this moment called for theater. I took one step closer, lowered my voice, and said, "I'm here to pick up a prescription for my son who was in a car accident and might never walk again. Do you want to trade problems?" I even managed to put the slightest tremor in my voice. It was Oscar-worthy. I don't know where it came from. I didn't plan it. It just happened. Now, let's be very clear. That was a lie. Not a tiny embellishment, not a rounding error of the truth, a full-blown, dramatic, extra chapter in the afterlife kind of lie. I was actually there to pick up a gift card for my son who's perfectly healthy and spends his weekends playing flag football in an adult rec league. But in that moment, I committed. The transformation in her face was immediate and spectacular. The fury drained out of her like someone pulled a plug. Her mouth fell open, her eyes widened. She looked like she had just kicked a puppy and then realized there were witnesses. "Oh my God," she stammered. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. I just held her gaze for one more second, then turned and started walking toward the store. Behind me, I heard her engine start. By the time I reached the sidewalk, she'd reversed out of her spot in a rush and sped away, abandoning the very sacred parking buffer she'd been defending with her life 30 seconds earlier. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. The whole thing had lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like a short film. A very strange, morally questionable short film. On one hand, I'm not in the habit of inventing tragic backstories to win parking lot arguments. It's not exactly a sustainable conflict resolution strategy. On the other hand, the sheer absurdity of someone melting down over a neighboring car had triggered something in me. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even really about teaching her a lesson. It was about matching the energy in the most disproportionate way possible. If she'd just said, "Hey, I'm not great at parking and I get nervous when cars are close," I probably would have shrugged and moved. If she had asked nicely, I might have even humored her. But she didn't ask. She accused. She demanded. She acted like the existence of another vehicle within standard parking distance was a personal attack. So I gave her something to recalibrate against. That's the move. She came at you with a parking tantrum. You came back with a tragedy. Not because it was true, but because she needed to understand that her problem, a car existing near her car, wasn't a problem. You gave her perspective in the most dramatic way possible. Was it honest? No. Was it effective? Absolutely. She went from screaming to apologizing in 10 seconds flat. When I came back out 15 minutes later with my completely non-medical purchase, the SUV was gone, the space next to mine was empty, the world had righted itself. I slid into my car and sat there for a second, replaying it, the horror on her face, the way she sped off without another word, the silence afterward. Was it over the top? Absolutely. Was it necessary? Probably not. Did it instantly shut down an unreasonable confrontation without further escalation? Without question. I don't know what story she told herself afterward. Maybe she drove home feeling ashamed. Maybe she told her friends about the mean man in the parking lot. Maybe she decided to never confront anyone again over a parking space. What I do know is that she learned in real time that you never really know what someone else is dealing with. Even if, in this particular case, what they were dealing with was a gift card and a flair for dramatic delivery. I'm not proud of the lie, but I can't pretend the look on her face wasn't deeply satisfying. And if she ever finds herself about to roll down her window and scream at a stranger for existing too close to her vehicle, I hope she remembers that day, because next time she might not get a performance. She might just get someone having a worse day than me. Ask a dumb question, get a stupid answer. Good job, OP. And our second story. When you demand an employee stop working free overtime, be prepared to pay for the gap. My boss learned that the hard way. I used to work for a nonprofit that held several high-profile government contracts. On paper, it was mission-driven, community-focused, and deeply committed to service. Behind the scenes, it functioned like most organizations that survive on public money and private egos. My role had grown significantly over the years. What started as a fairly straightforward communications position turned into strategy, branding, grant support, crisis messaging, and internal marketing for multiple departments. The problem was that no one quite knew where I belonged organizationally, which meant my reporting line kept shifting until I eventually landed under our state's executive director. That's when things got interesting. The ED and I did not click. I suspect she didn't appreciate that I was confident in my expertise and unwilling to nod along when something made no sense. I don't bulldoze people, but I also don't shrink myself to make someone else feel taller. Apparently, that was enough to land me on her problem list. Before reporting to her, my previous boss had trusted me completely. I worked full-time while finishing both my bachelor's and master's degrees, and I was raising 2 kids as a single mom. As long as the work got done, no one cared if I logged in at 6 a.m., 11 p.m., or during nap time at a soccer field. It was flexible, it was humane, and it worked. The ED did not operate that way. She scheduled weekly one-on-ones with me on the day she worked from home. I use quotation marks intentionally. Those meetings had a distinct atmosphere. As someone who grew up around addiction, I recognized the signs immediately. Some days she was sharp and functional. Other days she was slurring criticisms and finding creative ways to dismantle my confidence. I tolerated it because I needed the job. About 4 months into reporting to her, my cousin was diagnosed with breast cancer. To make matters worse, her husband left shortly after the diagnosis. I was her only family nearby. She had chemo appointments, scans, and long days where she couldn't drive herself home. I went to my ED and explained the situation calmly. I'll need some flexibility to take her to treatments, I said. I'll still get my work done. She leaned back in her chair and said, "You'll need to take PTO for any time you're not physically working." I blinked. "I'm salaried." "Yes," she said, as if that solved the argument, "and per your contract, you're required to work 8:30 to 5:30 in the office." I had never worked those exact hours before. I worked far more than that, just not always between those walls. "Understood," I said. So I complied. I began arriving at 8:30 on the dot and leaving at 5:30 on the dot. I stopped checking email at night. I stopped logging back in after my kids went to bed. I stopped answering quick questions at 10 p.m. I stopped spending my weekends polishing deliverables. For years, I had quietly made sure everything got done. If a department needed a last-minute flyer or strategic messaging pivot, I handled it. If a grant required weekend revisions, I handled it. If leadership dropped something in my lap at 4:55 p.m., I handled it. Not anymore. 2 weeks into my strict adherence to contract hours, I received an email asking why several internal clients were being told their marketing projects would be delayed. I responded, I am currently operating within my contracted hours, 8:30 to 5:30, as directed. She called me into her office. What's going on? She asked. I'm hearing that you're telling departments you don't have capacity. I don't, she said plainly. I'm no longer logging on from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. to make sure everything's covered. She stared at me. For the first time, I could see the math happening behind her eyes. All those after-hours fixes, all those invisible saves, all the unpaid overtime disguised as dedication, gone. Well, she said tightly, we can't have work falling behind. I agree, I replied. That's the moment. She demanded strict hours, you gave her strict hours, and suddenly all the hours that had been getting done quietly and visibly after hours stopped. She didn't realize she'd been running on your unpaid labor until you stopped providing it. Now the math's on her desk, and she can't argue with it because it's exactly what she asked for. She didn't walk back the 8:30 to 5:30 rule. She didn't grant flexibility for my cousin. She didn't apologize for the PTO demand. Instead, she did what bureaucracies do when faced with reality. She hired another marketer. Not a contractor, a full-time employee. Salary, benefits, onboarding costs, the whole package. For a nonprofit constantly preaching budget constraints, it was an expensive lesson. The new hire was great, by the way, talented and overworked almost immediately, because once leadership realizes how much invisible labor you've been doing, they either acknowledge it or try to replicate it with more bodies. My ED never admitted she'd miscalculated. She never rescinded the office hours policy, but she also never again questioned why I refused to donate my nights to the organization. I showed up at 8:30, I left at 5:30. I took my cousin to chemo using my PTO because that's what she demanded, and I stopped sacrificing sleep to protect a system that didn't protect me. The nonprofit survived, the contracts remained intact, the budget took a hit. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without checking my email. And our last story. She owes $60K and has a for sale sign out front. A couple years ago, I decided I wanted to learn how to drive stick. None of my friends had manual cars, and the only person in my orbit who did was my brother-in-law, Mark. He owns a gorgeous old muscle car, the kind that growls when it starts and turns heads at every red light. It's not subtle, and it's definitely not quiet, but it's his pride and joy. For context, the car wasn't mine, it was Mark's, and he babies that thing more than most people baby their pets. It's a manual, heavily restored, and worth a ridiculous amount of money. When it starts up, it revs loud for a second. That's just the nature of the engine. We made sure to schedule lessons in the afternoon so we wouldn't wake anyone. We weren't out there at 6 a.m. being jerks. We'd do a few laps around the neighborhood and then head to a nearby empty parking lot to practice smooth starts and hill control. On the third or fourth day, she appeared. Karen lived a few houses down, mid-40s, permanent scowl, the kind of person who talks like she's filing a complaint even when she's saying hello. She walked over while I was standing next to the car waiting for Mark. Nice car, she said, eyeing it up and down. A bit too loud for my taste, but still. Thanks, I said politely. She tilted her head. Mind trying to keep it down a bit? My baby doesn't really seem to like it. I blinked. I honestly didn't even know someone on the street had a baby. Yeah, sure. We've been doing it during the day so we don't wake anyone up. I didn't know. Sorry about that. It's not a problem, she replied, smiling in that fake, tight-lipped way. Just be quieter, okay? Then she walked off like she'd just issued an official warning. It annoyed me, but whatever. People complain about loud cars all the time. I let it go and told Mark about it later. He rolled his eyes and said, "We're not breaking any laws. We're fine." 2 days passed with no sign of her. I figured that was the end of it. Then one morning, before Mark even arrived, I stepped outside and saw her standing near the curb, arms crossed. "I thought I told you to keep it down," she snapped before I even said hello. "Sorry, I can't really control how it starts," I said. "We don't leave it idling, we just start it and go." "I don't care," she shot back. "Stop being so loud." Then she stomped back to her house. Mark arrived a few minutes later and we left for practice. We were gone most of the morning and came back around lunchtime. We parked, went inside, and didn't think twice about it. About 2 hours later, my sister and Mom came rushing over. "You need to look at the car," my sister said. My stomach dropped before I even stepped outside. The entire driver's side was keyed from front to back. Deep, deliberate scratches that went through the paint. One of the tires had been slashed clean open. It wasn't random, it was targeted. Mark just stood there staring, jaw clenched. "That's thousands in bodywork," he muttered. Only one person came to mind. We walked down to Karen's house and knocked. Before we could even speak, she shouted from inside, "I'm not apologizing." Mark didn't hesitate. "Then you better have a good case in court," he yelled back. "That car's worth more than your house, and I'm suing you for every cent." "Maybe keep it down then, you hick," she screamed. "Maybe you don't key cars and pop tires and you won't get sued," he shot back. It went on like that for a few minutes before we realized we weren't getting anywhere. We went home and called the police. When the officers arrived, we explained everything. The lessons, the previous complaints, her shouting through the door, the damage. We showed them photos and security footage from a neighbor's camera that caught her walking toward the car earlier that day with something in her hand. The officers walked down with us. "Ma'am," Officer 1 called out, "this is the police department. We need to speak with you about damage to a vehicle." "I'm not apologizing," she yelled from inside again. "They deserved it." Officer 2 looked at us and raised an eyebrow. Then he called back, "Ma'am, what you did is criminal damage to property. They're pressing charges." "I know my rights," she snapped. "You can't come into my house without a warrant." "You are partially correct," Officer 1 said evenly. "We can't search without a warrant, but we can obtain one for your arrest." She refused to come out. The officers left to secure a warrant. About an hour later, they returned. This time she wasn't shouting anymore. She was in handcuffs. That's the moment her whole strategy collapsed. She thought yelling through the door and refusing to come out made her untouchable. Instead, she just gave 2 officers a live confession. They heard her admit it. The warrant wasn't for the house, it was for her. All that noise and she ended up in cuffs because she couldn't stop talking. Turns out during her little rant through the door, she'd essentially confessed. 2 officers heard her admit she did it because we didn't listen. That didn't play well for her. Mark didn't mess around. He filed a civil suit for damages, which totaled close to $60,000 once you factored in custom paint, labor, tire replacement, and loss of value. The criminal charges were separate. The trial dragged on for months. She tried to argue noise disturbance. She tried to argue provocation. The judge wasn't interested. Agricultural zoning rules and noise ordinances don't justify vandalism. We won. She was ordered to pay damages, the criminal case stuck, and not long after, a for sale sign popped up in her yard. I still practice driving stick sometimes. The car's been fully repaired, and honestly, I've never found it easier to focus on smooth clutch control, knowing I didn't have to see her glaring at us from down the street. Funny thing is, if she'd just stuck to a polite conversation, we would have kept being considerate. We already were. But she decided to escalate over an engine starting in the afternoon. Now she's paying for that decision, literally. Let's talk about who really won. Story 1 was theatrical escalation. The parking lot ranter wanted to make someone feel small. Instead, she got a masterclass in dramatic deflection. Was the lie morally questionable? Sure. But in the moment, it worked. She drove off in shame, and the narrator walked into the store with a gift card and a story he'll tell for years. Story 2 was invisible labor made visible. The boss demanded strict 8:30 to 5:30 hours, so the OP stopped donating nights and weekends. Suddenly, project stalled, internal clients complained, and the budget took a hit, hiring another full-time employee. The boss got exactly what she asked for. She just didn't realize what she'd been getting for free. But story 3 wins, not because the revenge was clever, it wasn't. The neighbor did it to herself, but because of the numbers. $60,000 in damages, a criminal record, a for sale sign in the yard, all because she couldn't handle an engine starting in the afternoon. She escalated from complaint to confession in one conversation, and now she's paying for it every time she looks at that sign. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.